Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a little after 1 o'clock on February the 16th, 2022. This is a scheduled work session of the Astoria City Council and roll call.
Councilor Rocca.
Here. Were you able to hear me?
Can hear you now. Johnson.
Here.
Councilor Herman.
Here.
Councilor Hilton.
Here.
Mayor Jones.
Here. All right, Brett, if you want to go ahead and kick off the first topic, are we doing? Well, go ahead.
Yeah. So the first topic is dealing with an issue that was brought up at last month's council work session, where we were reviewing goals for next fiscal year, starting on July 1st. And one of the things that was discussed was wanting to bring forward the issue of what's called an exclusion zone, dealing with impacts, quality of life impacts is what I'll call them, within a certain area. And I'll let the chief get into a little bit more detail in a little bit as to what this means. And so the council asked that to be brought forward for more discussion. We've had conversations about it before. It was put on hold, but council's wanting to bring it forward. Since that period in time, there has been more discussion in the community, and I know amongst the council with regards to ways to address issues such as camping, such as sitting on sidewalks, addressing issues such as or other ways to be able to address quality of life issues, perhaps in parks or within rights of way. And so this issue has expanded in scope from what it was initially brought forward at last month's work session. I would note that there have been some discussions about the business community holding sessions coming up, perhaps sometime in March, to address some topics, and this is one of the items which has been brought up as a potential topic. And the mayor, as well as myself, have been, and the chief have been encouraging those interested in this topic to either participate on this work session or else review the video of this meeting afterwards, to be able to kind of understand what some of the limitations are with our law enforcement, dealing with laws in which our Oregon legislators have put in place, or proceedings and protocols that we have to follow in response to case law. And we are also letting folks know that this has been on the city council's radar screen and looking for additional tools to be able to address some of these matters. So Chief Spalding is going to be leading the presentation. There are going to be a number of folks who are going to be participating in this conversation. And we're going to be looking for, after some review of some information, some direction from city council about items that the council would like us to be able to move forward with more specifically. I've also asked the chief to outline any programs that he feels would be important for the council to look at implementing first and foremost to be able to address some of these matters. So Chief Spalding, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Brett. I'm sharing my screen, and I want to make sure first off that you are seeing the actual slide versus the working notes.
We're seeing the working notes. We're not seeing the full slide.
Okay, let me fix that. Bear with me here. And Jen, as I try to share the actual slide and also view the other slide deck.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
If you start your presentation and then on that presenter slides, there's a display settings drop down you can choose. So if you go back to PowerPoint, then you should be able to switch which screens are which, and that might solve the issue.
Okay, in PowerPoint itself, or?
Correct. Yeah, if you start your presentation.
Okay. And where was that, Jonah?
So if you start your presentation now, go and do the view slideshow. Yep. And then in the top left there, it says display settings.
Okay.
Yeah, if you switch, that might, there you go.
Okay, did that work?
Yep.
Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, welcome, Mayor, Councilors, Jeff Spalding, your police chief. I appreciate the opportunity to bring you a lot of information today. With me and representing the Astoria Police Department is Deputy Chief Eric Halverson and Sergeant Andrew Randall. Both of these individuals have been involved in doing a lot of research behind the scenes, assisting with the presentation today. And I will also be calling on them through various slides to provide some additional information. They also know that they will be able to chime in at any point if I'm missing something. Again, there's a lot of information here, and I want to make sure I don't miss anything as much as possible. So I will either give them opportunities to speak, or they may just simply join in if I'm missing a key point. So,
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Your display switched back.
Oh, okay. How about now?
That's good.
That's good?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So a couple things by way of preface. I do want to explain what we're doing today. So in terms of what we want to present, there's a brief history, a little bit of how we got here. I want to talk a little bit about some court decisions, want to talk a little about some current laws, some of our current challenges, some potential tools that we want to offer. And then at the end, I have a list of items that we would like some direction from council in terms of prioritization of different items to address some of the issues that we're now experiencing. So throughout the presentation, I highly encourage council to interrupt me and ask questions as opposed to waiting to the end simply because of the amount of information. So I'm very comfortable with that as well. One thing I also want to preface is that the resources involved, the information that we gleaned for this presentation come from a variety of resources. As I mentioned before, both Eric and Andrew have done some homework. We also have reached out to CIS, our risk management pool and insurance provider, contacted their legal department, and they've agreed to assist us in responding to questions that we have related to the homelessness problem, as many agencies are experiencing these same questions, and they will ultimately contract out to an attorney who specializes in these types of things and share this information with other agencies that they provide the same services to. Additionally, we've also reached out to quite a few different agencies throughout the state, and even in Idaho, specifically Boise, since that's where one of the Ninth Circuit decisions emanated from. And then lastly, I also chair a statewide committee through the Oregon Association of Chiefs of Police on the homelessness topic, and includes a lot of chiefs, but also includes some city attorneys and some district attorneys and others. So it's a good cross-section where we're also obtaining a lot of information from as well. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of information we will be going through today, and in the interest of time, I will be going through it fairly fast. Again, I encourage you to stop me at any time if you want some additional clarity. These are very complex issues. We're operating in a lot of gray area. And we're also dealing with some very complex individuals as well. So this is not an easy topic, and we want to navigate this very carefully. Not everything we're talking about today is completely flushed out. Some of the concepts we will be talking about have either been tried in other jurisdictions, and at the same time, they're not necessarily ready for prime time. And if there's interest from council, we're happy to do the additional work and bring that forward to council. And if there is no interest, obviously we won't spend any more time on it. But again, there will be an opportunity at the end as we go through the final slide to identify what some of those things are, although I will give a brief description of each of those items. I'll also like to add that we are not experts in this area. We are relying on the experts in the field who are, including our city attorney, the CIS attorneys that we mentioned, and then sharing some experience from other agencies who have already put some of these measures in practice. So we are practitioners in the field. This is a problem that impacts everybody in our county, all of our social services providers, of course, law enforcement. So this is something that we intend to work on together with all of our partners. We don't feel that we can solve this alone, and it will take additional resources and additional working closely with all our partners to get to where we need to be. I will say that just about every solution that we provide, there are downsides to just about everything. So just to be aware of that, and I will try to identify those as much as possible. I can't guarantee I won't miss something because there will be some areas that we feel that may be a little bit more on the aggressive side to address some of the more serious issues, but at the same time knowing that we are operating in gray areas and there will be potential challenges from some legal perspectives. The other important thing to note too is the behavior that we're talking about from some individuals in our community is not reflective of the entire homeless population. We know and recognize that there is a relatively small population amongst the homeless population that are causing us the most significant number of calls for service and our biggest problems. So I want to make sure that we aren't painting any particular group with the same broad brush, and understand that there are a lot of good people out there amongst our homeless community, and we're identifying a certain very low percentage of those individuals who we need to make sure we impact. The last thing, or second to last thing, I will say that as we go through these slides and as we look at the different types of programs, we have really tried to take a look at this through a compassionate lens versus enforcement lens. We know that most of the enforcement tools we have limited effect, and we also know we're dealing with human beings who are in difficult situations, dealing with mental illness and substance abuse. So we want to make sure that, you know, that is always a consideration, that's always underlying in any program we put together. And enforcement is always a possibility or consideration, but we also say that voluntary compliance comes first. Any questions or thoughts before I go to the next slide? Okay, so the statement of the problem, I'm not going to delve into this too much. I didn't even bring numbers today. We all know this is a problem, and I think I'd be preaching to the choir if I was to go through all the numbers and tell everybody there's a problem, because we all know that. We hear it, I hear it daily from people in our community, from our officers, and it's a regular problem. The kinds of calls that we get as a police department involve just the increased visibility, which in turn leads to a perception of safety, which was very evident from our community survey. The increasing amount of trash left behind by certain individuals, the urination, the defecation, the illegal camping and the tent camping in certain areas of our community, loitering and panhandling items that aren't in and of themselves illegal, drinking alcohol in public, drug use, sleeping in vehicles, to name a few, are just some of the issues that we're dealing with. Historically, and some of what we'll be talking today is somewhat repetitive, and I also understand Councillor Hilton, you weren't here for a couple of the earlier program presentations, but I've been before council at least 6 times, specifically talking about items that have somehow spoken to the problems we've seen from behavior in our community and options to address them. Today's presentation actually started out as the city manager mentioned, as a topic of the expulsion zone, but it quickly morphed into a broader category of addressing the quality of life issues that we see in our community. And I will say that there's an extreme amount of crossover amongst all of the different things we talk about today. And somehow they all appear to be, well, not appear, but they are intertwined. And it's kind of like the old Chinese puzzle. You move one piece and it has an impact on something else. So it's important that we kind of tie all this together, because it is kind of a bigger long-term and short-term approach to addressing some of the issues that we're seeing. Eric or Andrew, at this point, I'll just say, is there anything I'm missing so far before we get into some more of the meat and potatoes?
So far, so good, Chief.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. So as I mentioned before, as part of some of our challenges, there's two court decisions in the Ninth Circuit, the federal Ninth Circuit, that have had a significant impact on how we address many of the ordinances that we're dealing with, or the behavior we're dealing with. And most significantly is the camping legislation. The Boise one was actually wrapped up in litigation for close to 12 years. And this is the one that decided that the 8th Amendment, which prohibits the cruel and unusual punishment from criminalizing the status of homelessness by punishing individuals for sleeping outside, you know, under the false pretense that officers felt that they have nowhere to go. This particular case talked about making arrests of individuals for camping outside when there were actually shelters open, but there was restrictions to the shelters, such as religious requirements and some other high barrier requirements that individuals could not get into shelters, and they felt that they could not be cited or arrested for sleeping outdoors when no shelter was available. The next case, it took this a step further in Blake versus Grants Pass, and this was a group of 6 homeless individuals that resided in and around Grants Pass that brought forward a class action lawsuit against Grants Pass, saying that they had a web of ordinance, customs, and practices that punish people based on their status of being involuntary homeless. The judge sided with the class of individuals in that particular case and expanded the 8th Amendment right to not have excessive bail nor excessive fines imposed for individuals that have no ability to pay, and therefore it was not cruel and unusual punishment. So in Boise, it was basically, you know, you can't arrest somebody, and then Blake took it a step further and also talked about not even being able to issue a citation for certain activity in some locations. This one also got a little bit more into detail as far as agencies, in order to take any enforcement, can establish ordinances that speak specifically to, as long as you have certain time, place, and manner restrictions, then there may be able to, then we as an agency may be able to establish ordinances that can control some of the behavior that we're seeing through these ordinances. But I will talk about that a little bit more in detail. So in the 2020 legislative session, House Bill 3115 was passed, along with 3 other ordinances that were specific to homeless individuals. I'll talk in somewhat detail about 3 of these. The last one I'll just touch on just to let you know that it's there. This one was, the intent of this one was to codify the Martin versus Boise decision, knowing that there's a possibility that case was going to be appealed. So it basically codified it, and it talks about objectively being reasonable in regulating where, when, and how people can live outdoors. And again, this one is a little bit more specific as to sleeping, lying, or keeping warm and dry outdoors on public property. And they're saying it must be objectively reasonable with regards to people experiencing homelessness. This particular bill, excuse me, did not offer any guidance about what objectively reasonableness looks like. And again, this is where we're operating a little bit in the gray area, and we've been seeking legal guidance on the best way to navigate this particular ordinance. This ordinance is the one that you're familiar with that requires cities to have an ordinance in place by 2023. So we actually have some time. However, with that being said, as you'll see here in a few minutes, there may be advantages to moving this legislation forward, which will give us some additional tools to address some of the illegal camping issues that we're now experiencing. Eric, Andrew, chime in if I missed something here. House Bill 2006, this one was specific to emergency shelters, transitional housing, and basically in a nutshell, it just basically tells cities that they have to approve homeless shelters if they meet certain criteria, and as long as they meet current building code. So that a city, county cannot deny an emergency shelter coming into their community. House Bill 3124, the meat and potatoes of this particular legislation, established that in order to remove individuals from established campsites after we have posted them, we have to give a 72-hour notice and notify local social service agencies. This really is a change from our past law, which used to say it was 24-hour notice. This really doesn't have a lot of impact on us because even though it was 24-hour notice, we still gave around 72-hour notice anyway, just to be additional compassionate. And we always notified social services when we posted the site and when we went back to see if anybody was still there. We actually, in practice, have not been doing a lot of the camp removals, especially that are out in the wooded areas, in part due to resources, in part due to weather. And we've been doing those more based on concerns from community members that call us when they see something that's out of place. The other part of this legislation went into a lot more detail in terms of how to handle individuals' personal property that is left at a campsite. This one is very problematic for us because it doesn't identify what is considered trash, what is considered personal property, what is valued to somebody, because it's very subjective. And we actually had a court challenge for our city a couple of years back, and we actually had to pay to purchase a cell phone and I believe some other property. I will talk a little bit more about this when we get to the challenges and proposed solutions.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Tom Brownson. Tom
Sure.
Brownson here. Just a couple things. Was there a definition for what emergency shelter is? Exactly what constitutes emergency shelter?
Maybe, yeah, Jeff, if you want to answer, I can also chime in too. So
No, go ahead, Brett. I'll let you field that one.
So an emergency shelter is something that the state fire marshal has defined some allowances, first of all, for emergency shelters to be able to bypass some building codes to be able to operate. And that's the scenario which is in operation at First Methodist Church now, where we have folks that are sleeping in the fellowship hall of that church, but it doesn't meet building codes, but there's certain criteria that have to be met. And there's a limitation on the number of days in which they can operate under that classification, like 90 days. And so in that case, we once took that emergency shelter through a conditional use process every year to ensure that neighborhood agreements were in place, and that was negated as a part of that legislation. But the legislation does have further definition of what constitutes an emergency shelter as well, which expands it beyond just those 90-day emergency shelter operations. So it does allow for more ability for folks to be able to be sleeping in spaces that do meet building codes for periods longer than 90 days.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. And Counselor, I will tell you that the basic definition out of the code, it says it defines an emergency shelter as a building or cluster of building that provides shelter on a temporary basis for individuals and families who lack permanent housing. It does go into detail on other types of housing. There's transitional housing. There's also low barrier emergency shelters and navigation centers. And I've made a note here to send you kind of the brief of that particular section. So it'll cover all that detail.
Okay, okay, thank you. And when you talk about campsites, just again, just for clarification, so people are allowed to sleep on the sidewalks because they can't find another shelter, but are campsites something a little bit different? Is that a variation, something you cannot allow? They have to sort of move on from one place to the other. How does that play in here?
Yeah, a good question. And as part of the complexity, I do plan to address that and hopefully that will answer your question. So when I get to the challenges and then also to some potential solutions, but some of that can be addressed through an ordinance. And that's where we talk about the time, place, and manner, where you can place restrictions on where you cannot sleep, the times you can or can't sleep, and the manner, such as, you know, whether it's a bedroll, a tent, cardboard box, or those types of things. So we will touch on those as well as one of the options in order to be able to effectively address some of these concerns.
Great, thanks.
I'd already talked about 3124. I'm not going to go into any detail unless, Brett, you want to touch on this one, but to my understanding is that because this is not within an urban growth boundary, this is probably for bigger cities, converting motels, hotels to emergency shelters. So I don't think it applies to us.
Yeah, it would apply to it. We do have an area. I mean, we're within an urban growth boundary. But I don't think this is where this was allowing the hotels to be converted over to those, but we haven't seen any of these happening in our community. So.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't think that it was applicable, but didn't spend any time on this one. So as we get into the challenges section, as we've mentioned before and at different council meetings, we have a lot of challenges as far as how to address it. I'll just go through the list relatively quickly and again, you know, allow questions, and I'll ask either Eric or Andrew to weigh in here as well. The constitutional protections, I'm not saying that these are wrong or bad. I'm just saying that they're there because many people do ask us about, you know, hey, I see people that are loitering or they're begging for money. You know, why don't you do something about that, police department? Years ago, it was not prohibited, but it did become constitutionally a protected activity. And so there's nothing prohibits anybody standing, you know, around on commercial or anywhere else in town and panhandling with certain exceptions, which I will talk about in a little bit. And then there's the Eighth Amendment we've already touched on as far as the cruel and unusual punishment and assessing fines and taking people to jail for the right to rest and sleep. And again, we'll touch on that in a little bit here. In the citation and arrest category, this is the revolving door that we speak about often. To no fault of our county partners, the space limitations of the current jail, they keep mostly Measure 11 type offenses. Those are your serious felonies. And there's just a limited space. The new jail will address some of this. So oftentimes when we arrest somebody for a relatively low level offense, we take them to jail. They're booked and released on a citation. And then anytime we simply issue a citation in lieu of arrest, it has a limited impact because either if it's a misdemeanor level violation, it will potentially go to warrant if they don't appear. And if it's a violation level offense, it will just mean that, and if they don't pay, it eventually will go to collections. And then we run into scenarios like we had some controversy a couple of years ago where we had an individual in town who had like $5,000 worth of fines that he couldn't pay. So that's a challenge. Again, I'll discuss a potential workaround here in a little bit. The circuit court, this is a relatively recent challenge, and having a conversation with our district attorney. He has received some direction from the court, and in part due to resources and volume of more what they consider dangerous cases, so to speak. They are asking the DA's office to limit bringing to them low-level cases such as trespass, thefts, and disorderly conduct. So even if we issue a citation, arrest somebody for certain offenses, it is possible that that won't even make it to court. So that's a potential challenge for us. And I may be oversimplifying it, and I'll ask Andrew and Eric to touch on that when I get to the bottom of this page.
Okay.
The camping in public and private, this is, as we've talked about before, the camping, we're operating in a gray area. There's legal challenges I've already talked about. There's the Ninth Circuit decisions. There's the more recent court decisions that limit our ability to address people that pitch a tent in public areas of town. But there is a distinction between addressing the individual and issuing a citation for an individual, or simply addressing the camp. But the problem with some of the camp sites is that we still have the ability to go clean up a camp in certain locations in the city and public locations. And with our most recent law that we now have to post for 72 hours, even if a tent is in a place where they're not otherwise entitled to be, such as a park, we still have to post it for 72 hours, come back, and there's nothing prohibiting that individual from relocating the tent to another area, another park in town, and then we start the process over again. This is one of the areas that we are seeking some legal clarity in our conversation with the city of Boise, their city attorney's office. They told us that they do exclude people from parks. They don't allow people to set up tents or camp in their parks. However, we believe that may be because they do have adequate shelters that are open and available, so that may allow them to do that. But this is an area that, again, we are waiting for some of our responses. I may not have touched on it earlier, and I will want to address it now, but we've literally come up with 3 pages of questions regarding some of these challenges relating to camping, relating to personal property, relating to camping and vehicles on the roadway, and one other area that's escaping me now. Again, this is the questions that we forwarded to CIS, and they're going to be working on getting us responses. We did have a couple of responses already, but we anticipate over the next few weeks, we hope to get some more clarity on some of this. But we already know that some of this depends on what our current ordinances are. And again, I'll touch on that in a little bit. Sleeping in vehicles, this has been a challenge for us. We've all seen the, I'll say, poor appearing recreational vehicles and other vehicles on the road where we believe people may be sleeping in them. We do currently have an ordinance that prohibits sleeping, or not prohibits sleep, prohibits abandoning a vehicle in a roadway. It can only be on the roadway for 24 hours. We still treat them as such, and if we come out and the vehicle's been abandoned, we generally will tow it. But it now gets complicated if somebody has been either in the vehicle or has been sleeping. Our question now is it still an abandoned vehicle situation, or is this now a camping situation where we have to post the vehicle for 24 hours, or I'm sorry, 72 hours, and then treat it as a camping situation? We do have some experience from some other cities, and I will talk about in a little bit. Eric and Andrew, I'll ask you to weigh in at this point before I move to the next slide.
Yeah, Chief, with regard to the circuit court, the lower level crimes are being reduced to violations. So they still are being addressed, but they're being addressed as violations, not as crimes. So the potential consequence would be a fine rather than jail time or a probationary status.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that clarification.
Chief?
Yes.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
When is the new jail projected to open?
Well, the last I heard, it was going to be a year from now, and that was a year ago. So,
okay.
With that being said, I believe Eric, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that they ran into a lot of issues during COVID and some other weather-related concerns. The latest timeline I do remember hearing is sometime around 6 months from now, but that's based on something I heard a while back.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, do you have any new information?
I don't have an exact date, but it is out of ways.
Yeah. So continuing on the challenges, as I touched on earlier, this is one that's caused a lot of frustration for our officers in terms of how we deal with someone's property. Oftentimes we come across piles of garbage just left behind, what we may interpret as garbage. However, oftentimes it's strewn with clothing that is wet and what we would consider not necessarily in serviceable condition. And then if we do take it, we're required to store the property for 30 days. We don't have a location to currently store it. We can't put it with our evidence because of potential concerns about cross-contamination of our evidence. I will share what some other cities are doing with that challenge when I get to that section, but suffice it to say for now that is a significant challenge on how do we address that issue. Clearly, there is some items that are clearly trash, food wrappers and the like. Then there's clothing and maybe a cell phone or something clearly is something that still has utility. But then there's the items that are in that gray area. And we have to be careful as a city so that we don't get sued and end up buying somebody a cell phone or some other rare collection of Harry Potter books or something like that. So anyway, I'll come back to that one when we get to the possible solutions. The next two, the mental health and the substance abuse, again, I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know, and our partners in these areas would definitely agree with us that they are operating with less resources than they would like to have. And in both cases, it's a pretty high bar before you can actually get somebody to involuntarily go into services, whether it's the mental health related or it's a substance abuse related. And so that's a challenge since many of the individuals we're dealing with are suffering from mental health issues or substance abuse issues or both. Another significant challenge is from a police perspective, because as we've said many a time, when people don't know who to call for concerns they see in our community, they call the police department when it may completely be a social service issue. We have significant differences in our community in terms of how people view this problem, where some individuals view this as we need to assist and take care of individuals, provide them services. To the other end of the spectrum, that this is hurting our community, it's hurting our businesses, it's an eyesore, it's a public health issue, and there's not a lot of common ground in the middle. At least that's somewhat anecdotal. That's my experience in talking to people, and that's a challenge as a police agency, and I'm sure it's a very similar challenge for some of our social service partners as well. And the last challenge we just put in the category of public education. It's hard to be able to, not everybody reads social media. We are aware of some other cities that have done some really nice job with different devices to communicate information. However, not everyone takes avail of social service or social media. And generally speaking, community town hall type meetings are generally poorly attended unless there's a hot button topic. So that is something that we would really like to focus on and do a better job at as far as public education, so that our community really knows what our challenges are. And what we're doing right now is one of our first opportunities to do just that. Eric, Andrew, anything on here? Okay. So that was kind of the negative side. So this is kind of where we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some options. The original topic and how this work session started was on expulsion zones. Before I get to that, councilors, mayor, are there any questions so far on any of the challenges we've talked about before I jump into this?
Chief, I just want to thank you for that, what has been thus far an extremely thorough background briefing. And the challenges that have been placed in front of the police department and the city by the courts and the state legislature are pretty significant. You've done a very good job explaining those to the folks that haven't been following this closely. I know it's very frustrating for our community members who aren't able to keep up with court rulings and state legislation, who just simply want to know the answer to the question, why can't the city do something about people camping at the Garden of Surging Waves? And so it's a very complex issue, and I really appreciate you digging into it and reporting on it this thoroughly.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate those comments. And we feel just as strongly as about our council and our community in terms of, making this a great place to live and continuing to make it a great place to live. And we all feel that, this is one of those things that we've seen in other communities that can very easily get away from us if we don't address certain type issues. And as I've stated before, in a compassionate manner. So the expulsion zones, I'm going to handle this one as a separate topic, and then I'll get into all the other ones as more brief topics. But the expulsion zone is designed to address individuals who repeatedly commit low-level criminal offenses in a particular identified area of our community. This is an area that is identified through the city council's designation. Staff will make a recommendation. If we bring this program forward, if this ordinance is approved, then we would make a recommendation about a particular area. And as an example, we could identify the downtown area similar to the map that is used for the ADHDA parking area. And council would approve that. And then in the future, if there are additional areas, for example, we wanted to add like 9th Street Park, for example, or the Riverwalk, those could be added, but it only will happen with council approval. So it's not something that we as a police department can arbitrarily pick an area, but it will always be based on some data that seems to indicate that there is a higher than usual level of activity, negative activity that's occurring in a particular area that we feel we need to address. So currently, when we, as I mentioned before, with some of our challenges, simply just arresting or citing individuals doesn't always alter the behavior. And again, taking people to jail doesn't always have the deterrent effect simply because the low-level offense, they don't stay there. There are quite a few agencies in Oregon that are currently using an expulsion zone or an exclusion zone or a civil exclusion zone. There are different names for them. I believe Salem calls theirs a crime prevention zone. So right now, expulsion zone is a placeholder name. We can call it anything we want. They all do about the same thing. Lincoln City, Salem, Bend, and Medford are 4 cities that we've looked at to look at how they are structuring their programs. So basically how these work is, again, I talked about the designated geographical area, and then there's a list of offenses. This is just a very partial list here, such as alcohol violations, sexual offenses, dog violations, theft, etc. Some of the common things that we do see that are on this list. And if an individual violates a certain number within a certain time frame. And again, this is something that we as staff would bring back a recommendation to council if we're going to move forward on this. For example, if somebody commits 3 violations from this list within a 90-day period, they would be excluded from that zone for a period of time. Generally speaking, I believe it's anywhere from 90 days to 6 months, depending on the city. There are certain offenses that would instantly put somebody on the exclusion list that are serious felonies, like a sexual offense or serious assault. You wouldn't have to get to 2 or 3 offenses to get somebody there. I've already talked about the geographical area. Again, that's something that council would approve. And then once somebody has actually been expelled from a particular area that we've identified, that can happen for anywhere from 30 days for up to a year. Depending on the city, there are different individuals identified in their charter that identify whether it's the chief of police or a designee or even the arresting officer can issue the actual expulsion order. I will say in pretty much all of these that a warning is generally given after the second offense. In other words, if there's 3 offenses to commit this to get to that level, then the individual will be given notice after the second one. So there'd be no misunderstanding that their behavior is not welcome and that an additional violation will have them excluded from the zone. There is an appeal process that's allowed. All cities have some form of an appeal process. And then if someone is excluded, there are allowances for certain things such as simply traveling through an area to get to work, to get to a religious institution or visit have a doctor appointment or visiting a family member. There are some exclusions. We do have to be a little careful about allowing too many exclusions because at some point you end up watering down the ordinance where it loses its effectiveness. So at the end of the day, if somebody commits the designated level of violations, they're added to the expulsion list. And then if they violate that list, they would then be cited or arrested for criminal trespass too, which is a higher level of trespass. And in many cases, it's a mandatory arrest. They're taken to jail. Again, what the county does with them is out of our control. But I am going to talk a little bit about a couple programs that may help address some of our limited ability to issue citations and make arrests. So this just gives you some examples. I'm not going to go through the whole chart, but suffice it to say that these 4 cities all have different provisions in terms of the types of violations that are on their list, how long it takes for somebody to reach a certain level of violations, whether or not they give a warning, who issues it, the offense if they violate the expulsion, and what the appeal process looks like. Again, if this is something that council is directing us to move forward on, we would then come up with recommendations that would fit for our community and then move forward. Okay, so before I move on, and again, as I've said before, at the end of the presentation, this will be the opportunity where council will be able to say, yes, we want you to move forward on that, or prioritize this amongst some other available options. So Eric or Andrew, am I missing anything on expulsion zones?
No, Chief, I don't think so.
Okay. Council, at this point, I'll stop for any questions on the expulsion zone before I move to the others. Okay. Seeing none. All right, so here's some additional options that I've alluded to earlier. I'll start with camping, which seems to be one of the ones we get most of our questions on. So based on everything that I understand and based on the Martin v. Boise and the Blake versus Grants Pass decision and the most recent House Bill 3115, our options are if somebody is camping on public property, we have basically 3 options. One option is to, if we have another shelter that we can direct them to, we can then enforce the camping and or the individual at that particular location. Option 2 is to simply not enforce it and don't have the additional shelter options. And then option 3 is to update our ordinance to include language that includes the time, place, and manner restrictions. This is one where several cities throughout the state have already instituted their ordinances. There's some school of thought in talking to one attorney that his recommendation is maybe we wait a little bit and see where all this goes since we have a year. But if we don't do that, that only makes it so that we have option 1 or 2, and they're not necessarily the most attractive options because we really don't have shelter options. But the recommendation for cities that do not have a wide option for other places that individuals can go almost are required to move forward on the ordinance option. And so just some examples here on what this looks like when I talk about time, place, and manner. For example, some cities have identified certain areas of their community where somebody can sleep during the hours of like 9 p.m. and 7 a.m., but they have to be gone by morning. And the place, some of them identified certain locations. Some have even gone as far as to say you can sleep on a sidewalk as long as you leave at least 5 feet of space. Some say they've identified certain parks that they can set up a temporary sleeping area in, and then other parks in the same city that are off limits. And then, of course, the manner is, the manner in which they sleep. Basically, both of the court decisions said that, that we have to be able to allow someone to keep warm and dry is the language they use. However, what that looks like is done differently in different communities. Some communities that simply, they'll allow a bedroll and a sleeping bag. There is one or two communities that actually do allow a tent. But again, that's not specified in the ordinance, and that's one of the gray areas. So Corvallis defined where someone can sleep in their City Hall Plaza between 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. City park system, including overnight hours when the park is closed to other users. They've defined other areas in town where someone can't sleep. Coos Bay excludes certain public areas. And the non-excluded areas are subject to time and manner restrictions. Gladstone excludes certain public areas, but then there's time and manner related to public spaces that are not excluded. And then they also have some time restrictions where you can't store property on city property between 6:30 a.m. and 9 p.m. And then Medford is one of the cities that actually does allow the use of tents. And then there are certain emergency exceptions that are allowed by the city. And then there's McMinnville and another couple cities that are already have ordinances in place. Let's see. At this point, again, this will be one of the things on the list at the end here that we, Deputy Chief Halverson has already taken the ordinances from other cities and has cobbled together a proposed ordinance that we will, with some more refining, be ready to bring to council if that's council's direction. So that's something that we could bring fairly quickly, although there's still some areas that we need some legal clarity on before we can do that. And that would then allow us to identify certain areas. However, the hard part of this one, of course, is who is going to make certain decisions as to what areas are off limits and what areas would we allow somebody to sleep. So that's probably going to be the biggest part of this particular one. Yeah, I'll move through the list and I'll stop at the end of this page for questions or input from my peers. Court diversion. So this is a relatively recent program. As I mentioned before, we have significant challenges of some of these individuals that we're dealing with do not have the ability to pay, and it doesn't provide any benefit by taking somebody to jail who's simply going to get cited and released again. Actually had a conversation with one of our current judges, also spoke to a couple of our partners at CCA, and we talked about potentially coming up with a program where somebody could be still cited into the court, but they'd be instantly diverted to a community group, which would involve some members from different social service agencies, along with maybe even a peer from the homeless community, be part of this group. This person that's cited into this group would be involved in doing some community service in lieu of a fine. If they don't complete that, they would end up back in the courts again. So this one is in the early stages, but there does seem to be some interest from the courts. I will say our district attorney is supportive of the program, but concerned about ultimately if the person doesn't follow through, they're still going to have challenges with any kind of a prosecution for whatever ultimate offense that might have to be advanced to the court simply because of direction that they're receiving from the circuit court. The next topic is the challenges with change in our practice. It goes back to 2016. This one I don't feel comfortable enough to talk a lot about because I wasn't here at the time, and I'm going to defer to Deputy Chief Halverson, and then Attorney Henningsgaard will also weigh in on this topic.
Yeah, so council, prior to 2016, Astoria Police Department was able to make arrests and send lower level criminal offenses through municipal court for prosecution, some of those being charges that the circuit court has capacity issues with currently, like criminal trespass, criminal mischief. And in 2016, one of the reasons that that decision was made was that the city paid booking and lodging costs for arrests that were made by Astoria officers, and the agreement with the jail doubled at that time. That was one of the considerations. There's also indigent defense that the city would have to pay for to handle criminal offenses in the municipal court. And at that time, we stopped sending criminal cases to municipal court. We do have criminal statutes that are still on the books for the city ordinance that are unclassified misdemeanors. All of those are being handled currently as violations, meaning that we can handle them with a citation, but we can't handle them with arrest or removing a person from a particular situation. Blair, do you want to weigh in?
Well, yes, I guess. If you remember, what happened was years ago, the former district attorney Marquis wanted to obtain all the DUIs from the city of Astoria. And at the time, the city prosecuted through municipal court misdemeanors, including driving under the influence charges. The city council at one point then decided to accede to Mr. Marquis' request and sent the DUIs over to circuit court, which resulted in a condition that the municipal court was no longer really a solvent activity. The DUIs did pay fines and had fees associated with them, whereas most of the criminal offenses did not. So that as a result, the city no longer had to provide indigent defense and no longer incurred any fees for booking prisoners, because those were all handled through circuit court. But the downside of that is that many of the offenses that were handled in municipal court ended up being treated as infractions anyway, and replaced the defendants were placed on probation by Judge Kino, who did provide some level of supervision for them. So a number of neighborhood nuisances in particular were alleviated by requiring that the defendant report back to Judge Kino periodically, usually once a month, sometimes once every 3 months. But it resulted in a situation that the problem was taken care of. That option really isn't available under the current situation. The other change that I particularly noticed was that when you have offenders in the downtown area that are cited for a crime and then brought into municipal court, oftentimes they don't even appear. And as a result, a warrant's issued. When a warrant is outstanding against an individual, the police have the right to approach them on the street and either issue a new citation or show cause date or bring them to jail. My experience, my observation was that the people who tended to be offenders didn't like that, and they generally just left town. And so it did result in a cleanup of the downtown area. That option is no longer available because when the police cite for an infraction, they can't arrest them. The person can't go to jail. And so they essentially don't show up to court. Nothing really happens. So that, I think, has resulted in some of the offenses becoming a little bit more pronounced in downtown Astoria. At least that's just my observation. But that was a factor, I guess, of the decision by the city council years ago not to allow misdemeanors to be prosecuted in the municipal court. Now, of course, that decision can always change, but if crimes are being prosecuted in municipal court, the defendant would be entitled to a court-appointed attorney, and at least according to the current procedures at Clatsop County Jail, when they're booked at the jail, there will be a booking fee that the city has been charged to the city. So those are costs that are associated with it that I can't tell you what those would be or what the budget for that would be.
Okay. Any other questions from council on that particular issue? Okay, I'll move on, and obviously we can always come back and address any one of these questions. So the next suggested tool on here is the chronic offender program. As we've mentioned before, many of the individuals we deal with, we see on a regular basis. We actually have several individuals that actually have over 300 calls for service from the police department. And when we talk about chronic offenders, it's not necessarily just chronic offenders that come across the criminal justice system. It's individuals that are a drain on services from all of our partners, everything from our mental health to our community service partners to the hospital. And so we felt that if we could have some impact on some of the highest offenders, that maybe we will have a quicker overall resolution to some of the volume of calls that we're seeing here, and definitely a reduction in the appearance in our community. And so I reached out to a work group that was already in place at Classic Community Action that I was part of, and we talked a little bit about, and the work group was established to help provide guidance for the existing two community homeless liaison officers, and talked about, can we bring forward into this group individuals who are on our radar on a frequent basis, and identify maybe the top 10 individuals and see if we can't focus on what these individuals need. Do they need additional mental health services, substance abuse services? What is it we need to address the persistent violations that we're seeing from them? This is, again, very early stages. Sergeant Randall is part of this group now, representing law enforcement side. But again, this is a social services group, and we're not targeting anybody. It's simply to take a look and say, how can we reduce some of the calls for service and the substantial drain on all of our social service and law enforcement systems. So early stages, something we're moving forward on, and we hope that'll bear fruit. So Eric or Andrew, anything else on this page?
No, Chief.
Okay. So and I'm sorry, I did promise council that if there's any questions on this page or the municipal court before I move on.
No questions.
Okay. The next category is one that we are getting a frequent amount of calls on, and that's the delinquent RVs and vehicles. Our current Astoria code does have some limitations on how we can deal with vehicles that are unlicensed or that play the moving game. And again, this is one where we come out and mark them for 24 hours and then they move at 2 blocks or even 20 feet. And we have to start the clock all over again. The other challenge, of course, is that sometimes these particular vehicles, there are people living in them. And so, based on what the courts are saying, are we treating these as, somebody that's violated the code, the intent of the Astoria code on abandoned vehicles on the roadway, or are we treating them as a camping situation, which adds a certain higher level of complexity to it. So we've identified 2 different agencies, had conversations with both Gresham and Roseburg in terms of how they're managing this particular problem. And I can tell you in Gresham, they actually have a menu of options that they apply to an individual that or a vehicle that's been left on the roadway, to include an unlicensed vehicle, expired registration, a vehicle that's parked on the roadway in violation of the recreational vehicle permit program. And in this particular case, this requires that somebody, it's as simple as going online, can apply for a permit to park their recreational vehicle on the roadway for up to 3 hours. It is intended for residents of the community who have a motorhome. They need to set it up before they go on a trip, or they need to clean it up, or whatever they need to do for up to 3 days before or after their trip. If somebody doesn't have a permit, then that would also be in violation of this particular ordinance. There's a few other things on there as well to include simply being in a state of disrepair or simply abandoned on the roadway. And then the other thing that both Gresham has done and Roseburg is in the process of taking to their council is an ordinance that basically says that if you've been issued a notice anywhere in the city, you cannot go move your vehicle to another location anywhere in the city and start the clock again. So in essence, if you've got a vehicle that's been expired registration for 6 months, you can't simply just go move it to another location. It can't be anywhere on the city streets. They've had that in place for a couple of years now. They have not had challenges to that. And these would be significant additional tools that could assist us in addressing some of these challenges with people playing games on some of those. I talked about panhandlers earlier. As I mentioned before, panhandling itself is a constitutionally protected activity. There are situations, though, that this can become dangerous. We addressed one of them a couple of years back when we established the unlawful transfer ordinance, the sign over by McDonald's, where somebody will approach somebody in the line and can back up traffic and could cause rear-ender collisions and what have you. That's been relatively effective. The other situation is where you have panhandlers that are going beyond simply just standing on the corner with a cardboard sign, where we've actually had calls where somebody's been at ATM and they've had somebody approach them at their ATM, come up to them in an aggressive manner or use abusive language. And it also prohibits certain times of day. Wilsonville has had success with establishing an ordinance that restricts certain types of panhandling that they consider aggressive. So as I mentioned before, the challenges with personal property. One of the things that we need to do as a department is to ensure that we give our employees, and this doesn't apply just to police department, but also applies to public works and to our parks department, since they've done actually a very good job at cleaning up a lot of the personal trash that's been left behind. But we need to also make sure that we're, being clear on what are the best practices that we're seeing from other communities as far as collecting items of property, whether it has utility or it's trash or not. One of the biggest challenges, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a storage location. But in the city of Boise, they simply just rented or bought a Connex and found a location for it, and they're able to put the property in there. And in Boise, for them, it's just a simple matter of once they go to a location, they actually have a third-party company they hire that aren't city employees. They go out there and bag up whatever's at a particular location. They don't even inventory it. They do take pictures of it. They bag it up, identify the location, and somebody has the established 30-day period to come pick it up. They just have to say where they were at and identify the property, and they get their property back. They don't go to any extraordinary lengths as far as trying to dry anything. They collect it the way it was found, and they've been successful with that and have not had any challenges to that. So as a small city as we are, we don't currently have any storage locations. So this is something that we would have to either do similar, we'd have to get a Connex or rent public storage, or look for some area that we may already have and try to address some of those gray areas through effective policies that, citywide, not just for law enforcement. So that would be one way to address some of the personal property issues. Again, there's still always going to be the challenge of who's ultimately going to clean up these sites. It's a challenge for our parks people. I know it's a challenge for our public works and our law enforcement officers. oftentimes there are fecal matter, there are items of illegal items. Sometimes we find syringes and safety issues. And so huge problem, but that is one way that we could potentially address that. I've had some relatively recent questions about, I think even from the mayor on grocery carts. You know, we see a lot of those in our community. Historically, some of our grocery stores have not been aggressive in terms of going and collecting their carts. And when we call them, they generally don't go out and pick them up. We intend to reach out to both of our significant grocery stores in town and try to work with them to find ways that they can go collect the carts. If that's not successful, the city of Medford established an ordinance that required their grocery store owners to put permanent signage on their carts that identifies the owner of the cart, and that if the cart is not anywhere within the store, it's considered abandoned, and they will have to pick it up within a certain amount of time, or there's a small fine. And if they're not picked up after that 30 days, then the carts will be disposed of. And anybody caught with a cart off store property is cited for theft. So we do have an option. I do think it's a little aggressive. And as I mentioned before, our preference is to work closely with the store owners. We have good people that run both the stores, and I think we can get there without having to go to an ordinance. But this is an option if that's not successful, because that often, as we all know, is used as a transport for goods, and one of those things that we do get a lot of complaints on. Eric, Andrew, anything else here? All right, two more, and then we'll get to the next steps, and then we'll be happy to field questions. This one here is, again, one of those that we get a lot of questions on, people leaving property on sidewalks. We did come across an ordinance that Salem has. It's entitled Unattended Property on Sidewalk Ordinance. And basically what this says is during certain hours of the day that they identify, and generally speaking, I believe it's something like 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., that you cannot leave property on a sidewalk for more than 2 hours at a time, or I believe the individual will be cited, or they will collect and take the property and store it for a certain period of time. So that's an option that Salem has advanced. And then the last topic, I know this, we're looking at potentially an additional resource to do much of what we've been talking about today. Is already a challenge for our department as a smaller department. Most of the time we're in a reactive mode to addressing a lot of these issues. We'd really like to be at a place where we're being more proactive. We're looking at converting the part-time community service officer position to a hybrid position that would be a police officer position. We're actually looking at potentially identifying this person as a community outreach officer, or there's another couple titles where community resource officer, because what this position we would like this to do is focus on the homeless topic, but also do the community service functions that the previous part-time position did that was vacated when we promoted that individual to a police officer position. I know this concept is not foreign to council. I've been working with Brett in Human Resources to see the viability of this position. I would say that this position, one of the biggest pluses is something that's relatively recent, is the addition of an individual that Class of Behavioral Health is now would like to embed with the police department, and that's a mobile crisis worker who will work very closely with this position and actually go out and contact individuals, which would give us the opportunity to have that expertise at our fingertips. As I mentioned before, this particular position would be much more proactive than our current reactive stance, be more of a directed engagement, connecting individuals experiencing homeless and the families with resources for shelter, mental health and addiction services, and healthcare, just to say a few. We're still in development phase there's a lot of other things this position would do. At the end of the day, they're still a police officer. They would assist other police officers with calls for service as needed, but their primary focus would be on quality of life issues, livability issues, addressing some of the homeless topics that we've already talked about today, and working closely with Class of Behavioral Health on that particular topic.
So, Chief, before I go on, I had kicked out this concept to some of the counselors to get kind of their thoughts, and I've generally received some level of support, but I'd like to be able to have some discussion with the council mayor about this. We're in the budget preparation season, and while we know that our budget has been doing well over the past few years, we acknowledge, Susan and I both acknowledge that we're seeing rates of inflation that we've not seen before, and rates that are outstripping the state mandated or voter and approved and state mandated 3% maximum increase of property taxes within the city. And inflation rates are exceeding that amount now. We're looking at is going to not only have potential budget implications this next fiscal year, but fiscal years after that, assuming the inflation continues. I'm wanting to be able to have some dialogue from the council as to the prioritization of this. Just a reminder that the police department is a general fund budget department, and that I've heard some support about doing this, even if it means needing to look at being leaner on other departments' budgets in the general fund. We don't know that's going to be the case. Susan and I are still working that this fiscal year, and maybe if it's not the case this fiscal year, there could be ramifications in future fiscal years. And so I guess I'd like to be able to have just some brief dialogue to make sure that there's council consensus around this when we're putting together the budget for this next fiscal year. Mayor, I'll let you kind of wrangle that if you would.
Yeah, so recognizing that it could end up being painful if it means cutting another position somewhere else, or cutting another program or some service somewhere else, I think it's really important. I would rank this very highly in priority. We're hearing it from all of our citizens. We see it ourselves. It's very important to the community. So I would rank this very highly as a priority as you go into the budget season.
I would agree with that. I also think the idea of pairing the community services officer, or whatever we choose to call the position, with the classic behavioral health worker together to go out into the community and work with individuals would be a really positive thing. These problems are growing significantly. We've noticed a huge surge over just the past 12, 24 months. And I really think we need to do whatever we can to respond to these problems. And I think the community services officer position would be one way to do that.
I guess still have to look at, where we're going to find the money. I think it's a good idea. This is a serious problem. I have a question about where are these county homeless liaison individuals that were hired, and how do they work with your department here?
I would say, and I believe Viviana may be on the call too, so she may be able to answer some more specific questions, but I can tell you right now that we're not at a place where these individuals are actually responding to calls. That we are still handling calls. At some point, we would like to get to that place, but I will say that both of these individuals they're stretched pretty thin because they respond to the whole county, not to mention the fact that they also respond in pairs for safety issue. So we're really having one response for the entire county. And I know some of the philosophy has changed in terms of, using them more of a, they are a proactive response, and they do go out and try to find people services and what have you. And I know there's been some success stories, and they've had a lot of contacts with individuals, but the scope of the problem is of such magnitude that, I'm not sure. It's hard to say their effectiveness, and that may be a little bit soon. I do see now that Jerome Steegmans is on the call as well. Is their direct supervisor, also works for Clatsop Community Action. I'll leave it up to you if you'd like to call on him to maybe answer that a little bit better.
Well, I think that's fine for now. We don't have to get too dug down in it. And I'll just say that I do support the idea. I think that Councilor Herman's comments are well-founded, and trying to tie these a way to tie these agencies together and get somebody out on the street.
This is Councilor Rocca. I appreciate all the work that went into this and all the research. And I certainly could go along with my colleagues and support, pardon me, and support this effort. In the back of my mind, though, I still am going back to what I kept hearing over and over when I was interviewing people at the Warming Center a few years ago. And what they would say over and over again is that everyone is always telling us where we're not wanted, where we can't go. I wish someday someone would tell us where we can go. And that seems to me, this seems to me like we're playing from behind. It just seems to me if we could focus our efforts on establishing a place where people can camp and can park, where we would have sanitary facilities, restrooms, staffing with the help of our social service agencies, so they would be safe for the women who are escaping from abusive relationships and so on, that would eliminate so many of the problems that we are trying to deal with on an individual basis. The camping in our public places, the feces and doorways, all of these things that are just really bending the patience of the people who live here, by taking a positive step and providing a place where that can be. And then we can talk about the ways that we keep that from becoming a permanent encampment and so on, and deal with all of the negatives that could go with it. But it seems to me that taking a positive step toward a place where people can be solves so many of these problems at once. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a broken record, but I think that's where the solution is. And if we're not doing that, then we're playing from behind. Having said that, again, I will go along with my fellow counselors and support this, but I think it's the next best step, not the best step.
This is Councilor Hilton. I appreciate all the hard work you put into this, Chief Spalding, Deputy Chief Halverson, and Sergeant Randall. I would make a couple of suggestions. And number one is there's a organization in our community. The city has places. There might be a parking lot right now. An example might be between 12th and 13th, and CBH office is right next door. And there's a restroom right there, right across from the old YMCA. So those type of spaces are, if we look at them, what the availability is, what we have as a community as resources that we can maybe get ahead of the curve on this. So those are just some of the thoughts and ideas. And I also like the idea of, and this is off the topic maybe a little bit, but it is the sense of fines and of citations. I think, which I think you suggested, Chief Spalding, which was a way of community involvement, which would be, they have to, I need to look at my note here, it would be community service, and which would be either police in the area, picking up garbage and things like that. That would be maybe the impetus for change in behavior, but also encourage them to police the areas and pick up, especially like cigarette butts and things like that, or just simple garbage outside garbage cans. I really like where this discussion is heading. And I hope that we can work towards a solution sooner rather than later. Thank you.
So, Mayor, if I may say, there's more to come on the presentation. So we're going to be asking counselors more specificity about, or the chief is going to be asking more specificity about the programs you want to take on. The question I was asking is there support on the police front to be able to have this community outreach officer position to be able to help with those things, and maybe some of the items that Councilor Rocca and also Councilor Hilton had mentioned to be able to, because right now there is not the capacity within the police department to be able to fully engage with the social service agencies. And when the social service agencies are stepping up and adding more positions to partner with us, we're needing someone on our receiving end to be able to move forward with that. And I heard the support to be able to look at that as part of the next budget cycle. But now the chief is going to be going through next steps, and we'll be asking you for more specificity on specific items to be able to move forward. If you're ready for that, Mayor.
Great. Let's keep moving forward. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brett, Mayor. So the last slide here, as I mentioned earlier, is broken down in two sections. So there's the first four items here are items that we as just are basically programmatic, that we are going to put some more meat on the bones and pursue, such as the court diversion program that Councilor Hilton just talked about, the additional legal assistance through CIS, our city attorney, and also the other individual, Attorney Heisel, who also defended Grants Pass in their Ninth Circuit decision, and then the chronic offender program, and then working on the camping ordinance. I know I have that on both lists here, but we are going to continue to do some work. But there are other pieces to that where we will need direction, and that's why it's in both lists, because of locations where we would potentially direct people to if we move forward on that ordinance. But that ordinance is otherwise just about ready to go. Deputy Chief Howerson's done a lot of work on that one. We know that most of the things on this list, this is a high priority for our council and our mayor. And so in addition to preparing this work for today, we've also been working on some of these things so that, given the direction, if that's the wish of council, we're ready to bring many of these things back very quickly. So as we get to the next list and the direction that we are seeking from council, I will tell you that we've already talked about the homeless liaison position, so we can at least temporarily take that one off this list. If you're looking for any kind of a staff recommendation, I can tell you that there's a couple of these that are relatively simple in the big scheme of things, such as the RV handling changes, which I think would be good in giving us tools to address some of these derelict vehicles. The grocery cart ordinance, some of those shorter ones, really we could bring back very quickly. They've been modeled after other agencies. It's really more of where does council want us to focus most of our energy on, because we don't want to bring back everything all in one fell swoop, because I don't think that's the most effective way to do it. So Brett, is that kind of along the lines of what you're thinking about in terms of how we're going to move forward with this section?
Yeah, I mean, if you have things, easier items to be able to pursue, and then if there's some of the longer range items that are going to take more time to be able to pursue, providing some guidance to the council in terms of some of the other programs that you feel that are needed that may require some additional lift from the city council if they're wanting to move forward.
Okay, well, I would say, again, as we're talking about some of the ones that we can do relatively quickly, I don't want to get the wrong impression that we're looking to find ways to enforce more activity. But a lot of this is about people in our community feeling safe. And as we touched on from the survey, there are a lot of people who do not feel safe in certain parts of town. And if we can address some of those areas, I think that will go a long way. And so the aggressive panhandling, if the council would like to take a look at that ordinance, and the RV handling, because we get a lot of calls for those, and that would give our officers some tools. Those two alone, I think, would be easy enough, at least to bring back to council and let council take a look at them. The camping ordinance, again, I think that's probably one of the biggest priorities for our community in terms of how do we address these things? How do we address the calls and the problems we've had at the garden in certain ways? So I would like to dig into that one personally. But again, we're open to any direction from the council. The expulsion zone will take a little bit more work, but we do have the meat on the bones. That one does have its inherent challenges, but we can move forward on that one as well.
So, Chief, I mean, we've had more conversations about the expulsion zone, and that was kind of what was brought forward by the city council in their goal setting session as something to discuss, to pursue. If absent the kind of maybe more straightforward ordinances like the grocery cart ordinance or the RV handling ordinance, if we're looking at camping time, place, and manner versus expulsion zone, which one of those two and kind of the larger project type of related items would you recommend to pursue first?
Well, I would say camping ordinance, but I think the expulsion zone is a good tool for us. My only concern with that is right now what's occurring in the courts, with the district attorney's office direction from the judges about bringing forward what they're considering low-level type offenses. We did talk to Mr. Brown yesterday and asked if the court would look at these a little differently, knowing that somebody has already committed several lower level offenses to get to this place, and it's not just a simple trespass. He thought they might. I do know that I've had a conversation with one of the judges, and she is very supportive of a program like this. I would want to make sure that both judges in the court is on board, and we'd also have to resolve the issue of whether we're going to be moving some potential violations to our municipal court. So there are a lot of pieces to that I think will take a little bit longer, even though I know, at least I feel in concept, that the ordinance is a good ordinance to address some of the higher repeated behavior. I do feel that there are going to be a potential couple stumbling blocks that we're going to have to work through. So camping ordinance will probably be my first priority. The expulsion zone will be a close second. And then the other lower hanging fruit we could address at some upcoming council meetings. And I would like for if either Deputy Chief or Sergeant Randall have any additional thoughts on that too. We all, have been talking about a lot of this stuff, and our brains are swelling from some of the information. So I'd like to make sure that they get a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, as far as the camping ordinance, I think that is a good priority to have as far as time, place, and manner. If we want people to know where they can be and where they cannot be. And I think that would help tremendously in addressing some issues.
Yeah, and I think that would address some of Councilor Rocca's concerns. And again, some of the shorter ones, such as we talked about the RV handling, the panhandling of the grocery cart, those are ones we could, bring over the next couple council meetings, and those are relatively short.
For me, this is Councilor Rocca again. The other priority would be those tools you identified for dealing with aggressive behaviors would be high up on the priority list. And I also, in a lesser way, I did like your more objectively reasonable way to deal with left property in terms of storage, where you take a photo and put it in a bag instead of having to try to inventory it and everything. I think makes a lot of sense in taking some of the burden off of the folks who have to deal with that.
Thank you, Councilor. And that does remind me, one of the reasons the property storage is even on this council consideration list is because there are a couple things that do have financial implications, and one of them, of course, is the actual physical storage. Whether we get rent some public storage, or if we get a container and finding a space to put it. And then there's also the part of it, whether we'll continue to have city staff try to handle this, or do like some of the other cities have done, where potentially hire a third-party company to deal with some of the property removal.
So I want to say that there are some serious financial matters. If we're looking at that, we'll need to be talking with the council about how to address that, because it's not a cheap endeavor because the space has to be conditioned. The state has put in criteria in which have to be met, and to be able to have that area, and we have to have personnel that manage those storage spaces. So I would say that there's some other items that I would recommend looking at first, because if the council is wanting to do that, we're looking at a serious financial bite that we're needing to make to address that aspect.
Well, I thought that there was some requirement of storing their property if it gets left behind, or if we move them and it gets left behind. Can you just quickly clarify that again?
Well, there's any property that we take that has utility, at least we believe might have utility. Of course, this gets back to the age-old question is, one person's trash is another person's treasures, and identifying property, because it is so subjective, that's a big challenge for us. But with that being said, anything that's obvious trash, we can simply throw away. But if it's something that might have utility, such as a backpack or some clothing or what have you, that's the type of items, for example, like what Boise is doing. They're just bagging it up, noting the location, storing it for 30 days. That's the requirement from House Bill 3124, is a requirement to store it for 30 days. And then the individual can come claim their property, no charge, anytime within that period. They actually don't get a lot of people picking up everything, and they end up simply just disposing of it after that time. So we would simply just take a picture of what we're putting in the bag it, throw in a Connex container or something like that, and which is what Boise is doing. If there's items that are of evidence that have some evidence value, then we would have to book those into our property evidence system here. Or something that might have higher value that might have to be booked into an evidence as well. So it's kind of three ways.
Yeah, I mean, counselors, I would say we have not, since the pandemic, we have not done large scale cleanups like we did pre-pandemic. So if we were going to start doing large scale cleanups, going into the forest and contracting or having our staff do those large scale swaths of areas, that's when we're going to need to have the storage and the individuals who are designated to maintain the air circulation and also the tracking of the materials, is if we do that. Kind of what we've been talking about today, or how do we address some of the other issues? We haven't, as a part of this, haven't even gotten into the question of, does the council want us to go into the forest and start sweeping again? Because during the pandemic, it was recommended that we suspend those actions. So the chief, I don't know if you want to talk about that. I mean, we didn't even get into that conversation today.
Yeah, I did touch on that a little bit earlier, at least in terms of what our current practice is, and it really hasn't changed. And especially now when we're in inclement weather, it's unsafe for officers to, go out into some of these locations because they end up slipping and sliding or sliding down hills and what have you. Not to mention when we only have 2 or 3 officers on the street any given time, it takes them away from their ability to respond to more urgent matters quickly. So that's a challenge. And not to mention what you've already stated in terms of storing property, and where do we have that we can redirect some of these individuals to go to. So that is a challenge. I will say everything you said about property is accurate. However, with some of the growing problem that I feel we are seeing, like at the Garden of Surging Wave and some other locations where property is being left behind, we still have to deal with that. And that is something that people see on a regular basis. We get calls fairly frequently, and we're going to need to find some ability to store some of that stuff. So not to the level of what you're describing from taking down a full-blown camp, but I can tell you behind City Lumber, there's a big pile of stuff right now that I couldn't honestly tell you if it's trash or if it's, someone's property, but that's going to have to be dealt with. And so there's lots of those throughout the community.
Well, that's what that was my question really is about, in the context of what we're talking about today and the areas we're talking about today, that there may not be any avoiding the property storage question ultimately. So fine on that. And I'll just say for my part, I think that the camping ordinance work, time, place, and manner is, I think that's a great idea. I would love to see some list of identifiable places where people could go, where we could designate if such a place exists. I mean, that seems to be one of the things that when I've looked around and in the past had these considerations at any level, it's been hard to really find places that we can actually have to support that sort of thing. So if there is, I'd love to see it. And the low hanging stuff, also aggressive panhandling, RV handling, I'm all for that. And since we're already working on the expulsion zone, maybe it's a longer term project on that, but I would like to see us continuing in that, taking a look at that.
So on the camping ordinance, one of the things, that, and we're not wanting to get into the specifics of where that would happen. Cities are taking the approach of saying where folks can camp or where they can't camp. Those are two different approaches. I think that it's, there are going to be limitations. It can't be, they have to camp way far away, where there no, it's outside of a certain area. I'm going to tell you that staff has, identified various areas and that are possibilities. And a lot of them are park areas. And so the question is it's going to come down with a council conversation when we look at the camping ordinances. How do you want to approach that? And how do you want to be designating those areas? And we know it's going to be a tough discussion and a tough dialogue for the city council to have. Jeff, you want to talk about that anymore?
Yeah, no, just the only other thing I would add is everything you said again is accurate. The court decisions were very clear that, cities cannot simply establish a blanket ordinance that says that you just can't sleep in any park or anywhere. You have to have either somewhere they can go or have the time, place, and manner ordinance in place. So in order for us, the first option, since we have one shelter that's open maybe 90 days a year, and a high barrier helping hands, we really don't have a lot of options. And so to me, I feel that our time, place, and manner ordinance is our best bet and one way to compassionately move forward.
I support the chief's prioritizations, and I'll just add my opinion that it's frustrating that I feel small communities, cities, pretty much are being left to foot the bill for these huge societal problems, both literally and figuratively.
I would agree.
Yeah, I support, and thanks again, Chief and Deputy Chief, for this thorough presentation. It's great to find that, if you search far and wide, there are some cities that have been able to find some workarounds and some ways to at least regain some of their public spaces and some quality of life for the community, despite what the state legislature has done and despite what the courts have ruled. And I absolutely support the camping TPM changes to our ordinance. I think it's critical that we can identify, while we cannot prohibit camping on all public lands, we can at least say there are some of our public lands that it's going to be prohibited. And I think, those high visibility areas that the community has identified as having spent a lot of money to make very nice, such as the Garden of Surging Waves, such as the Nordic Heritage Park, which will have a ribbon cutting in June. I think we all want to see that never is allowed to become a campground. And there's plenty of other places within walking distance that are public land that would be less burdensome to the community than in one of our very prominent parks that's filled with artwork, and that's also a cultural heritage site. So, while you move forward on drafting this time, place, and manner changes to the ordinance, what prevents us right now from going to the Garden of Surging Waves and telling folks, we've identified of the however many 300 acres of parkland that the city owns, that this 1/8 of an acre, the Garden of Surging Waves, is off limits effective immediately. What prevents us from doing that?
Yeah, and I'll let Eric or Andrew weigh in as well. But my understanding, to the best of my knowledge right now, is that because we don't have an ordinance in place that tells them where they can go, we don't have the ability to necessarily enforce that. Now, with that being said, if the warming shelter happened to be open that night, we would be able to direct them to that place, and then we would be able to enforce it. Again, there are two different distinctions here. We're talking about the individual, and that's where the court decisions have talked about the cruel and unusual punishment. Different story about dealing with the actual property or the tent or the campsite, because they're not allowed to set up certain items beyond, basic necessities for keeping warm and dry. The area that we're not 100% comfortable with is whether or not if they are in an area that they otherwise do not have a right to be, such as a park that closes at 10 p.m. Logically, I would believe that nobody can be there. In other words, an individual experiencing homelessness doesn't get a free pass because they, because of their status. But that's not what I believe the court is saying. And so, I'm getting some differing opinions and also seeing cities handle that differently. So kind of a warm and fuzzy, not a clear answer for you, Mayor, but, some of our officers are telling people, the park closed at 10 o'clock, you can't be here. They're not looking at it as a camping situation. They just happen to be hanging out and they're told they can't be there, which, as with anybody, can't be after 10 o'clock. So that's how we're handling it now. And Eric and Andrew, I'll let you weigh in more as a boots on the ground.
Yeah, Mayor, the different cities we've talked to, like the chief has said, interpreted that in different ways. So we're trying to find, what the opinion is, but also we're looking for direction on what, where the city council would like us to go with our enforcement of that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so from my perspective, to the extent we are able to, I would like to have people removed.
Recording in progress.
From the Garden of Surging Waves specifically, as they're probably our most high visibility public park, where for whatever reason, that's where lately more people have chosen to go and set up tents. So on the other issues, Chief, I would also agree with you that, the easy ones, if the delinquent RVs and vehicles issue, upgrading those ordinance per Greshams and Roseburgs, if that's easier to do, then absolutely that would be something that would make a difference to the community. The aggressive panhandling, the restrictions like Wilsonville has implemented, I'd like to see that. I do have a question. Is it does it have to be directed at panhandling, or can it be any aggressive verbal approach? Because we do hear a lot of citizens say they were aggressively approached with a verbal barrage of some sort. It may not have been related to asking for money, so it's not panhandling, it's just an aggressive approach. Could the same ordinances that, you know, give a distance and time, you know, not after 6 p.m. or before 6 a.m., could that also apply to any verbal approach, or does it have to be panhandling?
So there are other laws already on the books that do address certain unruly behavior. Eric, would you touch on that?
Right at the top of my head, the disorderly conduct may apply depending upon the behavior that's going on. There are certainly free speech issues that it depends on public, it depends on the behavior. Certainly we would respond to those if somebody called, regardless of whether we think we can charge somebody or not, just to keep the peace, but potentially disorderly conduct in that situation.
Okay, thank you. On the grocery cart, oh, go ahead.
Mayor, can I add something there for you?
Please.
So what Deputy Chief Halverson said about that is, you know, the free speech component is really protected. But what I think makes the aggressive panhandling a more unique situation is you're asking somebody for money and you're using aggressive behavior in doing that. And so that's going to raise that to some kind of offense level where just the yelling and shouting and insulting, the courts have shown that that's a protected activity.
Okay, that I understand. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. On the grocery carts, I would agree if you can achieve the results you want with working with the store managers, great. But if not, I'd be in favor of a Medford style ordinance on the grocery carts. And I'm also in favor of, you know, as a number 2 priority behind the camping TPM ordinance changes, also looking at the expulsion zones and moving forward on that.
Okay.
So let's see if there's no other comments from the council. It's been a really great brief, very informative, very helpful, and hopefully the recording will get spread around the community so that people can see some of the challenges and then some of the opportunities.
I need to speak to that. We just discovered there's been technological glitches going on with regards to road recordings.
Okay.
So
well, in any case, maybe the chief will have an opportunity in the next few weeks, maybe to just give the presentation again, essentially, and record it, and then we can just send it around.
Okay.
So, do you need any more guidance from the council on this particular topic before we move on to Parks and Rec?
If you're asking me, Mayor, I feel I'm pretty clear in terms of next steps and what the council would like to see.
Great.
Hey, and Mayor, I've just been contacted by an individual, Katie Frankowitz, who has graciously recorded the meeting. So
good.
I'm hopeful that KMUN will be able to share their recording for us. Katie, thank you for letting me know.
And is that a visual recording too? So in other words, will the PowerPoint slides be visible, or is it just an audio recording?
Katie, can you chime in if you're able? Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and thank you, Katie. And you know, I'm sure that some smart person can take that audio recording and marry it up to the PowerPoint slides maybe and do it that way.
Okay.
Either that or just Chief can record it again with the slides. I think it's important for people to see those slides as well.
Yeah, we can do something like that. So thank you, Katie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. So Brett, we have been going for 2 hours, so why don't we take a 5-minute break and then launch into topic 2. So 5 minutes.